Well, well, well. If it isn't the YouTube viewers, I bet you guys are only here because you want to know what the dyno figures were for this turbocharged Classic Mini. Well, you're in luck. Today's the day. Now, before we get started on all of the numbers, how everything went, all of that, I do want to mention that the turbocharged giveaway that I was running and have been running for the past few months, I'm going to extend for another 2 months. So it's going to end in April of this year, the end of April. Since this project continued to take more time, continued to have more things that I needed to do to it, I thought, you know what, let's extend that and give you guys an opportunity to get those entries in. So just a reminder to enter into that giveaway, every $5 spent on my merch store will guarantee you 1 entry. And it's unlimited. So whether you spend $5 or $45, the entries will correspond to every $5 spent. And if you have any questions about that, the link to the giveaway details is in my description, as well as the rules and regulations. So with that out of the way, let's talk about the dyno figures and all the things that went on during that dyno run and how we're going to be going from here, what's next, what's going to happen. So I dropped the car off at a dyno shop here in Charlotte called Baucom Motorsports. I want to say a huge thank you to him. This is not sponsored, but he did an incredible job with the car. He even ran into some hiccups and some issues and just dealt with them and addressed them, and no problems. Now, for those of you who have been following me on Instagram, which is where I post most of my updates about the channel, I did make a post offering up an opportunity to get some discounts and some free merch for those of you who guessed the power figures. So as of the time of actually posting this video, I will have contacted the person who won that and who actually guessed correctly. But unfortunately for you guys, I didn't get a chance to actually film the Mini on the dyno. The time constraints around my own real life job and the location of the dyno, it just didn't align and I couldn't get down there to film it. So I'm going to share with you guys the kind of experience, what happened at the dyno, and the numbers, of course. So he got this on the dyno, strapped it all down, did a few road tests beforehand, of course, and said the timing on this was actually really, really great. The map that was on it was damn near perfect, so a huge thank you to Steve for sending me that over and helping me get that set up. The shop was very pleased with how the power figures were operating, how things were kind of firing in terms of the mapping. Now, he did a few power runs initially, and unfortunately, I have my oil pressure gauge line running underneath the manifold over on the side here, and as a result, that actually melted and started spewing oil over there. So I have a new line. It's literally the only line that I didn't heat sleeve, and I'm kicking myself over it now. But he gave me a vice grip very nicely to hold that tight so I could drive the car home. And of course, HEL Performance is going to be getting me an oil pressure gauge line, and we're going to install that in this video. But after that was sorted out, he did get into actually tuning the carb. He ended up putting back in the BDD needle and dialing that in a little bit more. And he removed the part throttle lean off line. That's the line that goes from the top of the carburetor to the side on these turbo carbs. He actually removed that, deleted it, and capped those ends so that it doesn't lean off and throttle. And let me tell you guys that this car drives incredibly now. It's not laggy in the way that the throttle feels. It takes off from the line really easily. And honestly, sending it to that dyno and having him tune it has been some of the best money spent I've ever spent on this car. And for those of you who have been with the channel a long time, you know that Charlotte and more broadly, the US does not have a lot of dyno tuners that can handle an SU carburetor. Most just don't know about them. It's not a common carb used here. Most people are, looking at big blocks with like Holley carburetors, kind of things more targeted to the US market. You got to remember that this car was only sold in the US from 1960 to 67, so not a lot of experience. I'm very lucky in that the gentleman down at Baca Motorsports here in Charlotte, he's actually extremely familiar with these, Webers, all sorts of different stuff, and of course he's got a dyno to tune this stuff. Now, after he spent some time dialing in that, he did start to turn up the boost as well. I told him that I wanted to target 15 PSI to get started on this engine. That was where I wanted my power figures to be run and where I wanted to get all of my values for power and peak torque, all of those things. And I'll probably be leaving it at 15 PSI. I might even turn it down a little bit, which might be surprising to some of you guys, but I like to know what the power limits are, but I don't drive my car balls to the wall all the time. And I don't need that much power in here on a road car. Maybe when I hit the track, I'll turn the boost up, crank it up, and have some fun. But in general, it'll probably be at 15, maybe turn down a little bit. Now, I have the power figures right here, but before I share these with you, I do want to add a little disclaimer that power figures are one of those things that are subjective isn't quite the word, but it's similar to what these power figures are. They're always dependent on the dyno you're getting these measured on. So ideally, you get a measurement on an engine prior to doing any performance work, so you have a baseline on that dyno with that engine. And then you bring the same engine with the performance parts on it back to that dyno and get power figures on it again. Going in between different rolling roads are always going to get you different figures, and they're not going to be super reliable for you. And this is down to the mechanical nature of a dyno. A dyno can be calibrated in different ways. There's always different factors that kind of contribute to a different power reading. So I could take this car from this dyno and drive down the street to another dyno and get power figures that are off by 10, 15, 20 horsepower. It's very, very common. So if you're doing this build, your mileage may vary and you may not get the exact same power figures as me. But before I got this power figure, I brought this engine to the dyno and I got around 67 horsepower on this car, NA, with no modifications to it. So 67-ish is my baseline. We did a few power pulls, some were a little bit higher than that, but 67 is the average for the pulls that I did before. We go back to the dyno, get this on there, and drum roll please, the peak horsepower was achieved at 5,500 RPM, and it did maintain into 6,000 RPM as well, but at 5,500 RPM, it's got 166 horsepower at the wheels. His dyno is a wheel horsepower measurement, not a flywheel measurement. So 166 horsepower at 5,500 RPM. Now, to give you an idea, we're also looking at about 104 horsepower at 3,500 RPM, and then it jumps up quite a bit to 120 at 4,000. So you see that as that boost starts to come in, you start to get additional power, and that starts to ramp up pretty quickly. So from 3,500 RPM to 5,000 RPM, we're gaining almost 60 horsepower just from that turbo and the boost kicking in. Pretty cool stuff. Now, moving on to the torque figures, the peak torque actually happens a little bit sooner at 5,000 RPM, and we're achieving 170 foot-pounds of torque at 5,000 RPM, which is awesome. For those of you who don't know or who haven't been in a high torque vehicle, torque is what gives you that feeling of going fast. Horsepower is going to give you that, peak power, that peak speed, but the torque is what really makes you feel like you're hitting the road quick, puts you back in your seat, and that's what kind of gives you that feeling of going fast. So comparably, at 3,500 RPM, which is where my horsepower was about 104, the torque is already at 156 foot-pounds. So at 3,500 RPM, we've already got a boatload of torque, and you can definitely feel that in the torque steer and the way that the car behaves and tries to track. After getting my suspension aligned and getting all of that done, it helped tremendously with the torque steer. However, there is still torque steer, and that is the nature of a turbo and the nature of a front wheel drive turbo. It's just gonna happen, and it's life. Even with the limited slip differential, still a lot of torque steer. But it's totally manageable, and if you have some mechanical compassion and you don't just blitz the throttle every single time you go somewhere, you're gonna be in good shape and you're gonna be able to maintain control absolutely no problem. So, those are the power figures. There they are. Peak is 167 horsepower and the peak torque is 170 foot-pounds. Pretty crazy stuff, pretty exciting. It's very fun. It is very, very fun to drive, and I'm very happy with those. As you guys know, my goal was 150 horsepower, 150 torque, and I've exceeded that, and I'm a happy camper. I don't know if I mentioned, all of these power figures are at 15 PSI, so I think the engine could actually handle a little bit more boost. I could turn it up at some point and see if I can get some higher power figures, but at the same time, I'm not trying to blow up my engine, and I want to drive this for a long time. You know, the car is starting to show its age in a lot of places. It's starting to rust, and I want to get as much time out of it as I can before I have to really think about repainting it, doing body work again, and all that. So I hope that you guys were excited about those numbers. There's been a lot of work put into this. I'm proud of it, and I want to thank you guys. You guys have stuck with me through this whole project, and it couldn't have been possible without you. So, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, now that the engine's run in, now that we have a good tune on it, let's take it apart so that we can start cleaning up some stuff, fixing up some issues that we ran into, and getting it, you know, ready to be on the road for a while. So jump over to the engine bay here with me, and I will share with you guys what's next. Now, some of those issues that the dyno ran into, nothing too serious. He did mention that it does get pretty hot, and part of the issue that he ran into was related to heat. Over here on this side of the engine, I have my oil gauge pressure line, because I have a mechanical oil pressure gauge. That line actually melted. And he initially thought that it was the manifold directly that melted it. However, it was actually my choke cable. The choke cable itself underneath got very, very hot because of the sustained heat and sustained running on the dyno. And as a result, that was resting on this braided line. And even though it's stainless, inside it is still a rubber hose. That's the case for anything that's stainless wrapped. This choke cable actually melted through it, and that's what caused some oil spray situation over here, which I'm sure was extremely exciting for him. Unfortunately, that probably really sucked. So sorry, John. But as a result, you can see there's a vice grip down here holding that oil pressure line. So that's part of what we need to do today. And we're going to be changing the oil. We're going to be getting into some of the service items after engine run-in, those types of things. But I have some exciting stuff too. One thing that I have never had on my car is a tach. And I've always wanted a tachometer on my car. So we're going to rearrange the gauges a little bit. So I still have my boost gauge. I still have my water temp and oil pressure. They're going to be in a new combined gauge. And then I have to run a tach and a tach feed from my ECU, but nothing too crazy. First things first, we need to kind of start taking apart the things in here so we can get to the oil pressure line feed and fix up those hoses. And I think there's an oil leak on my oil filter housing, which I need to address as well. So let's get to it. Now this next part, we're going to replace this oil pressure gauge and this water temperature gauge, which both show individual values on them, with a new set of combined oil pressure and water temperature gauge and a small tachometer, and of course the boost gauge for the turbo. The water temperature gauge is one of the capillary style tube water gauges, and this gauge needs to be run out to the car and out into the regular sending unit very carefully. All right, so you guys can see here my whole oil filter housing system. Obviously this line right here comes from the oil pickup inside the engine. Oil gets fed down to the takeoff block down here, or rather the remote filter housing down here, and then through the oil filter and then back up into the engine and dispersed as it needs to be. Now, some of you probably might have guessed this already, but in general, I like how compact and tight this is. However, serviceability is really difficult, and I can reach in here and undo this, but every time it dumps oil everywhere, and that's not ideal, as you can imagine. So I think what I'm gonna do, even though it's gonna be a pain in the butt, I'm gonna redo this AN line here. The top one should be long enough already, but I'm gonna redo this AN line and I'm gonna run them into the fender, and I'm gonna put my oil filter inside the fender. It can live over there, and then it'll be out of the way of all of this, and it will prevent a lot of the oil dripping down here in the front, especially because I'll be able to service it much easier and I won't spill oil every single time I do something. Now, as you can imagine, getting a shot up in this wheel well while I'm working up there is pretty difficult. There's just not a whole lot of room for a camera to sit here and kind of aim into this space. But what I've done is run two lines, an inlet and an outlet, through the inner fender. You can see these in the rubber grommeted holes with the two lines running out and up to the actual oil filter relocation bracket. This is something that I got from HEL. They produced for me for the car. Now, once it's up there, the filter needs to be protected, so I wrapped it with some rubber and a Jubilee clip, and then you can see on the back side of that filter relocation bracket a takeoff for the gauge line. That gauge line is going to get connected up, and that's going to run back probably through the upper fender there and over to the gauge on my dash. Pretty straightforward setup, and there's actually a lot of room in this area of the car, so if you have to relocate something, it's a great place to do it. All right, so now we have all the gauges installed. The last thing is to verify that they work. So we have to verify that the oil pressure actually reads an oil pressure. Our water temp starts to climb when the engine starts to heat up. And then of course that my boost gauge is still working, and the tach over here is reading the RPM after the car's been started. So first things first, whenever you've changed the oil system, it is extremely important to verify oil pressure before you even try and start the car. So I don't know if I ever talked about this on the channel, but this is actually my engine start button now. The reason it's over here is because the new 2-inch exhaust that is running all the way back from the front of the car doesn't fit with my round early style tunnel and the rod change shifter. So unfortunately I had to move that start button. It's just a fake sitting down there now to this simple relay and solenoid based starter. I've got a little bit unusual custom starter system. This is different than what you guys would see on any other car. But anyways, let's verify that oil pressure by spinning the engine over with that starter, making sure it comes up to pressure. All right, there we go. We've got about 60 PSI on turnover, which is great. Very happy with that. So now, with that out of the way and that verified, the next thing is to start up the car, make sure that tach is working, and to let it come up to temperature a little bit. All right, and there we have it. You can see the gauge is starting to climb up, and what's cool about this gauge, although the capillary tube is not my favorite style of sender, it's extremely accurate when it's not having any problems. Those tubes tend to leak over time, but when it isn't leaking, you get great readings, and you can see that the water temp there is persistent even when the car is turned off, because it's a simple mechanical gauge. Unlike the oil pressure, well, the oil pressure is also a mechanical gauge, but unlike the boost or the tach, which requires an electrical signal, this one is all based on the pressure of the capillary tube internal freon, or I think whatever pressurized air is inside that thing. I don't really know. But anyways, that's that. Okay, so that is going to wrap up the dyno results video. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing the results from this dyno session. I really wish that I had been able to film it, but unfortunately sometimes things don't work out exactly the way you planned. But if you guys have any questions about those results, the kind of details about them, let me know. I'll do my best to kind of answer any questions you guys might have. I have a really good idea of how he tuned the engine, the things that he had to modify, all that stuff. So hopefully that'll help you out, and it kind of gives you guys a baseline or maybe a target to hit if you are doing a build similar to this one. Now, if you guys haven't seen, I have recently released a video of a new project that I'm picking up and doing. It's a Mark I Cooper S engine rebuild. Very, very cool stuff. And these are the two Cooper S blocks and heads that I have here that I'll be helping to rebuild and repair. If you guys haven't seen that video, it should be popping up in the corner for you guys to check out, and you won't want to miss that series. It's going to be a really, really cool deep dive into a period rebuild of a Cooper S, a Mark I 1275, which is pretty rare. It's not something that you get to see every day, and it's not something that you get to do every day. So very, very much looking forward to that, and I hope you guys will enjoy that too. But keep an eye on the channel, because we will be doing this series, but also I will be doing some driving videos and some other stuff here coming up in the next few months, now that the turbo engine is complete and the car is driving. Thank you so much to everybody that supported so far. A huge shout out to my patrons who have really made this build possible. You guys are the ones who help provide that ongoing support so I can tackle big projects like this, namely the turbo build or even these Cooper S engine builds. These things cost a lot of money, and you guys really, really help out the channel and me to bring these videos out to you. So anyways, that's gonna wrap up this episode. I hope to see you guys soon, and you guys know the drill. Until I see you again, enjoy those minis and motor on.